here is Ken Stern. We recorded this a little earlier. He was an NPR CEO, and for, I think, like 10 years, and he one day decided he was in a bubble and he was going to leave and go see the country and talk to the conservatives. He wrote a book about it called Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. And here is the interview we just recorded earlier. Ken Stern, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So you were the CEO of NPR, which to my audience is like the heart of liberal darkness. So you were really coming out from a place of sheer left-wingery, but you found that you started to feel that you were in a bubble. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, so in addition to NPR, I live in a 94% Democratic ward in Washington, D.C., 100% Democratic household. So, yeah, I live in what clearly is a liberal bubble.
And so what motivated you to actually try and get out?
So I think there are a couple things. One is just a deep concern about the growing partisanship in this country, the polarization, the fact that we're increasingly living in a place where the right and the left don't know each other. And when you don't know each other, it becomes really easy to demonize the other side. So I can't do much about that on a sort of global basis, but I want to do something for myself and get out. And Atticus Finch said in To Kill a Mockingbird, if you want to understand someone, you have to see things from their point of view, and I wanted to do that.
Okay, so what was the procedure? What did you start to do?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually not such an obvious thing what you do when you want to see things from the other side. So there's, in fact, a lot of different things I did over the course of almost 2 years.
Okay.
I traveled the country. I spent a lot of time in evangelical churches. Here I am, a nice agnostic Jew from Washington, D.C., spending time with evangelical churches. I went pig hunting in Texas. I went to NASCAR races. But, I also did lots of things. Like I just went to Pikeville, Kentucky, and spent a couple of days there. I spent a lot of time in Youngstown, Ohio. I just spent a lot of time with people who I ordinarily wouldn't spend time with, trying to understand their perspective and their point of view. I did a lot of listening in this trip.
And was it a shocking experience?
Yeah, so yes and no. I mean, let me actually sort of step back. The Washington Post did a couple of years ago what they call a word cloud. They went to Democrats and said, give us one word to describe Republicans. And they did the same with Republicans. And it all came back nasty. I mean, Democrats said sort of the worst things about Republicans. They're bigots and they're greedy, and Republicans had equally bad things to say about Democrats. And so I had to sort of say to myself, I don't believe that, there are 80 million really bad people on this side. But, somewhere deep inside, I knew those words were there too. So I went out and, both surprised and unsurprised, I found lots of people who I admired. Lots of people trying to do the right things for their families and communities. Sometimes I didn't agree with them, but I always found them to be sort of thoughtful and interesting. And when you get out, you find that Americans actually almost ruthlessly moderate when you get talking to them face to face. They tend to sort of move towards the middle, maybe not in polls, but in real life. And that was one of the great things that I found. It was always easy to find common ground when you were face to face with people.
It really is interesting to me. One of the things that happened to me as a kid is I did the same thing. As I was a kid, I wanted to be Jack Kerouac, so I wandered all over the country. And one of the things that always shocked me was that people have much more complex moral worldviews than the people who are supposed to be their superiors in the media. That the people in the media are always lecturing them, but they actually have a much more complex and interesting moral worldview. So you're an agnostic Jew, you're sitting in an evangelical church. Were you listening to things that shocked you?
Shocked is not the right word. I think it was interesting when I sat down with Pastor Steve. So let me tell you. So I ended up spending a lot of time in an Assembly of God Church in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I was actually counseled to go, having been to a mega church, go find a small Assembly of God church. I said to myself, where the hell am I going to find an Assembly of God church? And I ended up Googling it and finding there were 100 different congregations within, a stone's throw of me. So I picked one randomly and ended up with Pastor Steve at the Freedom Church in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And we actually had tons in common. We were similar age, similar family structures, a wife and a 10-year-old kid, similar backgrounds, different views on faith, but really lots of things we agreed on. And I met other people who had sort of the same experiences. on any 10 things, we probably agreed on 8 of them. So why are we fighting about the 2 when we could find 8 to find common ground on?
I actually do believe this. I believe that about 70% of the country agrees on 70% of the issues, and we constantly are talking about because it makes better TV. Did your mind change about anything? Did you change your positions?
Absolutely. So you have to start. I mean, what my mindset was had to start with the notion like, how could I be right on everything? I'm as self-infatuated as anyone else, but I had to say, look, I can't possibly be right on. But I picked a bunch of issues which I thought I was going to be right on, but I knew I wasn't anywhere close to being expert on. Gun control, climate change, poverty programs, things where I had sort of well-honed life instincts, but I knew my knowledge was thin deep, sort of surface deep, and I went out and found experts. I spent a lot of time with John Lott, the conservative economist, learning about gun issues. I spent time with a lot of research. I spent time hunting and going to gun shows and talking to lots of people who knew a lot more than me. And you know what? Not surprisingly, I actually came away with a much more nuanced view of issues.
Yeah.
I wasn't converted necessarily to being a gun rights guy, but I have a very different view of the issue. Just to tell you a bit of a story. So I went hunting in a place called Gonzales, Texas. Went pig hunting and had a great experience there. And it's about 8 miles as the crow flies, but 30 miles by road from Sutherland Springs, where they had the last church shooting. And having had all these experiences when that happened, I sort of viewed it very differently. I mean, I sort of saw all the liberals running out immediately saying, gun control, gun control, gun control. But I knew the issue was much more complex because of the time I spent on the issue.
So the book is called Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. Is that fair to say? I mean, you wouldn't actually do anything shocking like vote for a Republican, would you?
I might. So it's, yes, heresy. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I mean, avowedly Democratic, spent time in Democratic politics. But for the year that I did the book, or year and a half, I actually went and changed my party registration. I became a Republican and tried this, really sort of live that life. And when I was done, knowing a lot about sort of my research and motivated reasoning, I was open to the possibility I would stay a Republican. In the end, I didn't. But I didn't become a Democrat either. I'm now a registered independent because I see value in both sides. And also, I've become very skeptical about both parties and their ability to represent the country as a whole. So I would vote for the right Republican, and I would vote for the right Democrat, depending upon who they are.
Now, I started out as a liberal and became a conservative over time. And one of the things that happened to me was I found that my liberal friends were genuinely intolerant. They were genuinely intolerant of other opinions. They could not listen to me. One thing I found almost repeatedly was that they could not listen to my changing opinions for more than 30 seconds without cursing. Suddenly I found that their language became incredibly obscene. So I would be talking to someone I thought was the nicest person, and suddenly this foul language would become. Did you have that experience at all? Did you find that as you became sympathetic to the right, that your left-wing friends became less sympathetic to you?
So my 10-year-old son has been known to boo my television appearances now. I went on Tucker Carlson at the beginning of, as soon as my book came out, and he actually, I'm told by my wife, he booed my appearances. And I think there's actually a sort of a moral story there. He's not like, he thinks he's right about everything, even if he doesn't know anything. And I think that's a truth of the matter for a lot of us. The bad experience I've had coming back is social media. And sort of the, if I learn to love the right, which to me doesn't mean necessarily agree with everything, but it means to sort of feel the bonds of affection that Lincoln talked about. I must also be a white nationalist or a gay hater or Benedict. All have been called by people who haven't read the book. And, there is that strain of intolerance that you're describing that I've experienced personally. I think it's a lot of places in society, not just on the left, but I certainly have seen a bit of it and has left me with somewhat of a jaundiced view of some of my former friends of the left. But the people who read I will say that I don't want to get carried away by social media. It's still a thin slice of America, thankfully. When I talk to people about it, whether they're conservative or liberal, often have good conversations about it. So there's hope for us yet.
Now, you were the CEO of NPR, and one of the things I truly think that drives people crazy, and I attribute a lot of the division in the country to this. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with certain Supreme Court, like Roe v. Wade, that didn't give us a chance to argue it out. Even if we had come to some kind of compromise, at least we would have fought with each other and talked to each other and confronted each other. When the Supreme Court makes a diktat like that, I think it's very difficult for us to resolve our hearts, even though the law gets resolved. But one of the things that I have to say, that as a right-winger, I just feel a lot of animosity toward the media. And I think that they are it's not just unfair. They are actually hostile and dishonest. And it means that instead of talking to my liberal friends, because I still do have liberal friends who I love and who actually are people of goodwill, instead of that, I'm listening to the New York Times, guys like Charles Blow at the New York Times, who I don't think should be allowed to write anything anywhere. I think he should be allowed, but I don't think he should be published in a major newspaper because he's an hysterical child. So do you look back on your time at NPR and do you think yeah, maybe we could have handled that better? Maybe we could have hired a couple of conservatives somewhere along the way?
Yeah, it's funny. I've lost my life membership to the public radio conference now because my book's not about media. Other books are about media.
Yep.
But wherever I went, people wanted to talk to me about it. So naturally. So, I got a year's full of feelings about people feeling left out by the media, looked down upon by the media. And it gave me a lot of time to think about it. And I don't... things have changed in the media over the decade since I left NPR. I mean, I think the media is different than it was 10 years ago. But, what I came back and said in a couple different pieces was, as I look back on my time at NPR, it wasn't that I thought NPR was overtly partisan. In fact, I think they're almost, they have sort of here's the view from the right, here's the view from the left, almost metronome-like, which I personally don't even love that. But there's an effect of groupthink. I mean, everyone in mainstream media is pulled from the same pool, and no matter how hard you try, it's going to have an effect. And what I've said is, look, you would cover race only with white men, no matter how well-meaning and dedicated to the craft. We can't cover politics with people who are mostly liberals. It's the same thing, no matter how dedicated to the craft they are. That has not been entirely well received by some of my former colleagues.
It is an amazing thing because it seems such a simple. I mean, I wrote a piece for the LA Times maybe 15 years ago where I said, if you want to stop your subscriptions from dropping, try hiring some conservatives. Just hire a few to represent other points of view. I mean, if there is somebody in the mainstream media who voted for Donald Trump, I would like to meet him because I simply don't think that exists. So let's talk about Trump for.
But before you get to that,
yeah.
I do want to say, I think your point there is exactly right. There are great people in the media, people who I really admire, but the trust level for the media is now around 35%. Some of that is caused just by the nature of the lack of trust in institutions generally, but it's also partly the media's fault, and I think they need to do be much more introspective about it than they are.
So let's talk about Trump because Trump has divided people on the right. He's divided people on the left.
Sure.
I have I've had a fairly steady reaction to him, which is that I've been thrilled. I've been thrilled by some of the stuff he's done. I'm not so thrilled by the way he behaves, but I do understand it. I do believe that he is fighting a media that he is fighting on the media on the media's terms. Is this, I mean, at Thanksgiving dinner, we all had these political arguments, of course, and mine was my liberal relative saying to me, this man is destroying the country. Is Trump destroying the country?
So, look, I'm not a fan. So let's just start off. No matter how much I've learned to love the right, I have not learned to love Donald Trump. I've learned to love a lot of people who voted for him and try to see him through their eyes, which is hard. I think on the setup is I think the media and Donald Trump have gotten into this cage match, which is actually to each of theirs advantage. The media gets to fight him, and it drives their numbers up, and Trump gets to beat on them, and it's virtue signaling to his base. I think it's destructive from both sides. I mean, it's destructive institutions that need to be that are important pillars of society. And I don't love the way he's divisive by nature. It's worked really well for him in politics. I don't think it's the right thing for the president of the United States to do.
Okay. I'm running out of time, so I want to ask you, going forward, if you could write a prescription and say, this is the way out of it, because it bothers me too. I mean, I am a partisan, but I want to be able to talk and compromise. I do not want to be constantly at each other's throats. I don't think it's good for the country. If you could write a prescription to solve this problem of division, what would it be?
Yeah, so I don't have a good thing. First, I'd start by getting, if I could wave my magic wand, I'd get rid of social media. I would support the Supreme Court on gerrymandering, because what we have is uncompetitive races around the country, and that allows the extremes to control Congress from both sides. But mostly I would say, let's get out of our bubbles, stop listening only to ourselves, listen to the other side. We actually have a lot to learn from each other. If we do that, we'll all be better off, even if we don't agree.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and I think that time is coming. I actually think, weirdly enough, that Trump, for all his divisiveness, is going to lead to another time, because I simply do not think that we can continue at this level of hatred for one another. Since you started by quoting Lincoln, I mean, he did say we are not enemies but friends shortly before we all started killing each other. I hope we can avoid that this time. Anyway, Ken Stern, Republican like me, how I left the liberal bubble and learned to love the right. Thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed it.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. It's nice to know that a liberal can come and talk to us and not open fire.